Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar, Navigating Nutrition Misinformation in a Food Infodemic. I'm Leslie Samay, Director of Professional Development at Great Valley Publishing, and I'm the host for today's show. Before we get started, I have 3 points of housekeeping. First, in order to claim your CPE credit, you'll have to remain with us through the entire hour-long presentation. Second, if you have a question, please use the comments box on the left-hand side of your screen to send your question to us. We'll try to address as many questions as time allows. Finally, Navigating Nutrition Misinformation in a Food Infodemic awards 1 CPEU in accordance with the Commission on Dietetic Registration CPEU Prior Approval Program. And now on to our disclosures. Tia M. Rains, PhD, has the following relevant relationships to report. She's an employee of Ajinomoto Health and Nutrition North America. Jessica Steyer, Dr. PH, MPH, PMP, has the following relevant financial relationships to report. She is a consultant to Procter & Gamble and Kraft Heinz. She received grant funding from CSL Seqirus and was a former advisory board member to Moderna. Funding from non-CPE revenue for CPE planning, development, review, and/or presentation has been provided by Ajinomoto Co., Inc. The responsible provider for this activity is Ajinomoto. Now I'm pleased to introduce today's speakers, Dr. Tia Rains and Dr. Jessica Steyer. Tia is currently Vice President of Science, Innovation, and Corporate Affairs for Ajinomoto Health and Nutrition North America. She has over 25 years of experience working in health and wellness initiatives within the food and beverage sector, most recently heading up the Egg Nutrition Center. She obtained her PhD in Nutritional Sciences from the University of Illinois and received her BS in Food and Nutrition from Arizona State University. Jessica is a public health scientist with expertise in public health policy, research and evaluation design, biostatistics, and advanced analytics. She's the CEO of Vital Statistics Consulting, the founder and host of the podcast Unbiased Science, and the executive director at the Science Literacy Lab, a nonprofit organization. And so with that, I'm pleased to turn it over now to Tia and Jess. Welcome to you both.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Really, I'm excited to be here to speak about this very important topic. And the reality is that, unfortunately, nutrition misinformation is pervasive. It's influencing the way that people think about what they eat, their health, and even who they trust for information. And we're all inundated with messages, whether through social media, influencers, or so-called experts, and it's becoming increasingly difficult to separate fact from fiction. So now more than ever, people are, as I said, getting their nutrition advice from social media, which, when used properly, can be a very powerful educational tool, but unfortunately, misinformation is rampant and it spreads like wildfire. So let's really break down why this is happening, the challenges we face, and where we go from here. So we've all heard people say, I'm sure, do your own research, or I did my own research, but there's a myth embedded in that statement. So it suggests that with a quick internet search, anyone can gather the same knowledge that experts have spent years developing. And in reality, as we all know, understanding scientific research takes more than just access to information. It requires proper context, training, and expertise. And research shows that many Americans don't trust scientists. And this really only reinforces the idea that personal research is equivalent to expert knowledge. In fact, some seem especially resistant to information when delivered in a scientific or didactic manner. So our role is to really reestablish trust and show that expertise in science is necessary for navigating some of these complex health issues, while also meeting people where they are and sharing information with transparency, empathy, and patience. And just one more thing before I go on to the next slide. It's not just about the information that we communicate, it's how we communicate it. And there's actually a lot of emerging data on effective communication, especially when it comes to misinformation and how connection is more important than correction. And even though we are experts, we have to be mindful of the ways we share our expertise and focus on relationship and trust building as a primary factor in successful communication. So I've assessed both formally and informally patterns in science literacy gaps and the themes that they share. So first, I wanted to discuss the lack of fundamental science knowledge. So many misconceptions in nutrition stem from a lack of basic scientific understanding. So one example I like to give is a misunderstanding of sugar composition of common sweeteners. So people often don't realize that table sugar, sucrose, and high fructose corn syrup have very similar fructose content. And this misunderstanding leads to misguided beliefs about the health impacts of different sweeteners. So improving basic science literacy can really help combat nutrition misinformation. Next, vulnerability to logical fallacies. Now, there are many logical fallacies, but one I like to give an example of is the appeal to nature fallacy, or the belief that natural foods are always healthier than quote-unquote artificial ones. And this, of course, ignores that many natural substances can be harmful, while some synthetic ones are beneficial. And so teaching critical thinking skills and common logical fallacies may help people evaluate nutrition claims. Overconfidence in scientific knowledge. So the Dunning-Kruger effect definitely plays a significant role. People with limited knowledge often overestimate their understanding of nutrition science, and then this overconfidence can lead to the spread of misinformation and resistance to expert advice. Encouraging humility and openness to learning can really help combat this. Now, as a data scientist, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention lack of understanding of research design. So some people really struggle to interpret scientific studies accurately due to a lack of understanding of research methods. So just for example, the importance of control groups in studies, and that control groups serve as a proxy for the counterfactual, what would have happened without this intervention or whatever it is that we're assessing. And so without understanding this, people may misinterpret studies or fall for poorly designed studies. And then finally, misunderstanding of the scientific process. There's a common misconception that scientific knowledge is fixed and absolute. And as we know, scientific discovery is an ongoing process that's constantly evolving. And this can lead to confusion when nutrition recommendations change over time. But we, of course, know this doesn't mean that the science was wrong. It just means that our knowledge evolved. Platforms like Facebook or X or TikTok and YouTube significantly contribute to the spread of nutrition misinformation. We have algorithms that often amplify emotionally charged content regardless of its accuracy. And the viral nature of social media really helps with the rapid spread of misinformation to large audiences. Then we also have unreliable websites and blogs. So many websites and blogs masquerade as legitimate sources of nutrition information. And these often spread pseudoscience and conspiracy theories related to diet and health. So teaching people how to identify credible sources is crucial in combating this issue. Then there's also misinformation hubs. Certain websites and online communities are dedicated to spreading false nutrition information. These hubs can create echo chambers, reinforcing and amplifying misinformation. I know I see this quite a bit. I'm a mom of 2 young kids, and all the Facebook mom groups, parent groups, there are a lot of echo chambers and reinforcement of misinformation, unfortunately. And then finally, bots and automation. It's really a whole new world, and social media has changed the game. And there are these automated accounts that significantly amplify nutrition misinformation. And they create an illusion of wider support for false claims. And understanding the role of bots can help people gauge the true prevalence of certain nutrition beliefs. So social media has become a primary source of news for many Americans. So I thought this was really interesting. In 2021, 71% of people reported getting their news from social media platforms, which is up from 68% in 2019. And I haven't seen the updated data, but I am sure it has only increased since then. And this shift has significant implications for how information and health data are consumed and shared. Now, the rapid spread of information on social media presents opportunities as well as challenges, right? Because it allows for quick dissemination of important health information, but of course it also facilitates the spread of misinformation. And studies have shown that false information can spread up to 6 times faster than factual content on these platforms. And there are several factors that contribute to this rapid spread. There's algorithm-driven content promotion, ease of sharing, echo chamber effects, and the emotional appeal of sensational content. Now, given the prevalence of social media as a news source, engaging on these platforms is crucial for addressing misinformation. So some strategies for combating misinformation include promoting digital literacy and critical thinking skills, encouraging fact-checking before sharing and amplifying information, supporting and amplifying credible sources of information, and always engaging in respectful dialogue to address misconceptions. Even though there might be times that we get very frustrated, it's very, very important to remain respectful and calm. Now, health professionals and educators can help by sharing accurate nutrition information on social media, developing engaging, easily shareable content, and collaborating with each other and other influencers to reach wider audiences. Personal anecdotes. Personal anecdotes have a powerful impact on how people understand nutrition and health. These stories, such as accounts of health improvements after dietary changes, can be compelling and memorable, but as we know, they may not always align with scientific evidence. So in the realm of nutrition, it's very common. I'm sure many of you have encountered stories of individuals experiencing significant health changes after, let's say, eliminating certain foods from their diet or adopting specific eating patterns. And while these personal experiences are valid for the individuals involved, they may not represent broader trends or scientifically proven effects. So here on this slide, I share a hypothetical scenario of a person who attributes their weight loss to the keto diet, while not factoring in confounding variables like a change in exercise habits and physical activity. And this was actually inspired by a conversation I had with my friend who said, he told me he dropped something like 15, 20 pounds. He did the keto diet. The keto diet is amazing. It must work. Look at my experience. It must work. And when I started to ask him some questions, did you make any other lifestyle changes perhaps? And the answer was yes. He cut out drinking as often as he was. He also started walking more. And so basically I helped call his attention to some of the confounding variables that are likely impacting those outcomes. And of course, it's much more difficult to tease out those extraneous variables when discussing individual anecdotes. But we also have to be aware that the appeal of anecdotes lies in their relatability and emotional resonance. So we definitely want to be careful not to discount people's experiences, but also help make them aware of some of these other factors that likely are impacting the outcomes that they're experiencing. Another concept that I think is really interesting to emphasize here is the risk perception gap. And this refers to the discrepancy between actual health risks and the public's perception of these risks. Now, in nutrition and health, this gap often manifests as a focus on factors that have minimal impact on our overall health, while overlooking much more significant health determinants. We know that fear plays a very significant role in shaping risk perception, and people tend to be more concerned about unfamiliar or poorly understood risks, even when the risks are statistically less likely to impact their health. So some examples of this phenomenon in nutrition, and I'm sure many of you could think of examples, but heightened concerns about synthetic chemicals in food, despite many being present in minute quantities and at very safe levels and after being rigorously tested for safety, a focus on food additives while overlooking more common dietary issues like excessive sugar or sodium intake, and fears about new technologies such as GMOs, despite scientific consensus on their safety. Now, addressing fear-based misinformation involves providing clear, accessible explanations of actual risks, helping people contextualize unfamiliar risks within the broader spectrum of health factors, acknowledging and addressing public concerns with empathy and scientific evidence, and emphasizing the importance of considering overall dietary patterns rather than focusing on individual ingredients or foods. A significant shift is occurring in how people access and trust health information, and increasingly, individuals are turning to their peers for health advice, sometimes as much as they rely on experts. So I thought I'd share, these are some findings from the 2023 Edelman Trust Barometer. They reported that people trust their peers as much as they trust experts when it comes to health advice. Platforms like Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok have become popular sources for health and nutrition information, often featuring content from non-experts. Now, there's a relatability factor here. Peer experiences and advice often resonate more strongly due to their perceived authenticity and relatability. And peer advice is often more readily available and easier to understand than formal health communications. So this really underscores some of the things I've already touched upon briefly, but the need for engaging content. We might need to adapt our communication strategies, implement humor, show a little bit about who we are as humans to be more approachable and relatable. This really emphasizes the importance of having a social media presence, balancing our expertise with our relatability, leveraging peer networks, and certainly figuring out strategies to counter inaccurate peer-based advice without dismissing the value of personal experience. So where does this all leave us? We're facing a landscape where misinformation is more powerful than ever, and people are unsure who to trust. But we do have tools to change that, and by promoting science literacy and engaging with the public in meaningful ways, we can rebuild some of that trust. So I'll turn it over to Dr. Tia Raines now to provide some more context on this issue.
Thanks, Jess. So you've heard for the past 15 minutes just what is the magnitude of the issue. And I think all of us in the nutrition field probably live and breathe this every single day. And so from our perspective, we've decided that it's not just nutrition misinformation anymore, but that there's truly this food infodemic where we have these self-proclaimed experts that are influencing public opinion about food, diet, and nutrition. And so we wanted to better understand, what was going on here and try to see if we could peel the onion a bit on where were people getting information, what was the extent of the misinformation, and to see if we could find any trends there that might inform how we can move forward more effectively to try to counter this growing issue within our, not only our country, but I think it's a global phenomenon. So we funded what we're calling a food infodemic report, which was a study of 3,000 consumers that represented folks all over the U.S. We did this in partnership with YouGov, and this was earlier this year, to try to dig down again and better understand the causes and the impacts of food misinformation. And I'm just going to share some of the results here today. The link at the bottom of this slide is to the full report. If you've ever looked at some of these research studies in the past, they are a treasure trove of information. And so I would encourage you to visit that and see if there might be points within that document that kind of help with misinformation as we go forward on how to address. So first of all, one of the things that we found, which I think just, again, reiterates what Jess was saying, is that people are much more likely to follow something that they've seen, especially on social media, such as putting garlic up their nose, than to check if someone that is on one of those platforms is qualified to be giving any advice at all. And then the next point here is an interesting one to me because it's reporting 7 out of 10 people have seen contradicting food advice in their social feeds. I'm surprised it's not 10 out of 10, quite frankly, given all of these self-proclaimed experts. But what I think is interesting about this, for anyone that started their career before social media, there was always this confusion around nutrition. And on slide 8, just referred to kind of this lack of understanding of the scientific process when it comes to nutrition. I think people forget that it is a science. And so maybe 20 years ago, before all these platforms, people were confused because the mainstream media was reporting new science that would contradict a prior study. I lived that when I was with the American Egg Board, the Egg Nutrition Center, because the science on eggs and cholesterol was evolving. And so there were studies that would show, yes, you need to be concerned about eggs. And then the next study would show that you didn't need to be concerned about eggs. And that was always happening. But now with social media, things move so quickly. As Jeff said, misinformation moves 6 times faster. And then all of a sudden you have all these people interpreting all of the new science as well as forming their own opinions that are not grounded in science at all. We know that 64% of people are more worried about what foods are safe to eat than they were in 2019. So even though they keep going back and believing some of the information on social media, it's starting to worry them, and we anticipate that this number will continue to grow. And about 40% of people are saying they've never felt more uncertain about their food choices. So what we're seeing is a lot of confusion out there where people don't know what's fact and what's fiction. And we also see it in our own lives. So 71% of people in our survey reported that they actually took on a new food behavior, even though they knew it wasn't grounded in science, because they saw it on social media. And only about half of people in this survey admitted to being a victim of food information, misinformation. So again, I encourage you to go to the report and look at all the statistics, but it just continues to reiterate what Jess introduced when she introduced the topic, that this is getting more confusing and it's becoming a growing problem. So what we wanted to do now is give a couple of case studies and to showcase how misinformation can lead to negative effects, both from a health standpoint, but also from a social, cultural standpoint. And transparently, I work for a company that sells MSG, and this is a poster child for misinformation, and it's going to tie back to some of the points that Jess brought up earlier in terms of how misinformation is formed. So just as a history lesson, the discovery of monosodium glutamate dates back to 1908, and it was a Japanese chemist who was studying taste, and he knew that there was a basic taste that had not been characterized, because at the time there were only the 4 basic tastes: sweet, sour, bitter, and salty. But he kept tasting something both within the country of Japan, but then when he traveled to Germany, in foods like asparagus, tomatoes, and cheese, that wasn't represented by those 4 basic tastes. And so that is what his research focused on. And he ultimately ended up taking his wife's seaweed soup, boiling it down and analyzing the crystals that were left after the water had evaporated. And he identified that it was predominantly the amino acid glutamate. Glutamate is one of the 20 amino acids that make up our proteins within our body. It's also the most prevalent amino acid in nature. So if you look at the composition of proteins, a majority of proteins will have glutamate as the predominant amino acid. So it is everywhere in nature. So once he identified the glutamate as being the source of that savoriness, he termed it umami, which means deliciousness in Japanese, and he tried to understand how he could make it into a tabletop seasoning. And so he paired it with calcium, he paired it with ammonia, he paired it with potassium, but he found that when he paired it with sodium, that it had the strongest umami taste. It had a nice crystal structure that was soluble in water, and it was something that could be put into a bottle and then used as a food seasoning within the household. And he had launched the company around the sale of this product, which he called Ajinomoto, which means the essence of taste, and he brought it to the Japanese people. And his interest was helping the people of Japan become healthier, because at the time they were malnourished compared to much of the rest of the world, because it was an isolated island that didn't have access to a lot of high quality protein sources. And from his perspective, he thought that by having this tabletop seasoning, people would enjoy their food, eat more food, and become healthier. So again, in 1909 is when it was introduced into the market. It made its way around the world and was consumed without any issue for decades. So what happened? Well, Jess had mentioned anecdotes, and that's exactly what happened. So in 1968, there was an Asian American physician who wrote a letter to the editor of the New England Journal of Medicine where he detailed his personal account of eating at Chinese food restaurants in the U.S. Not a scientific study. This was not based on anything other than a personal account, an anecdote of his experience eating Chinese food. And in this letter, he wrote that he found sometimes he would have these heart palpitations, nervousness, sometimes sweating. And in the letter, he said it could be caused by excessive cooking wine, could be caused by excessive salt, or it could be the monosodium glutamate. And unfortunately, because of what was happening at that time in the country, and it was just easy to latch onto that particular component, researchers at other universities started to inject large doses into the abdomens of laboratory rats and mice. And as you would predict, the dose makes the poison all the time, and there were ill effects caused by injecting MSG into these animals. And that really cemented the negative reputation of MSG. Now, the journal took it one step further, which is the problematic part of this story, in that they termed the letter Chinese restaurant syndrome. And to this day, that term still persists. It is denigrating an entire food cuisine, and it is linked to MSG without scientific evidence. What is the scientific evidence? Well, every major regulatory body around the world has reviewed the studies that have been conducted since that letter, those that were conducted accurately, and they've all drawn the same conclusion, which is MSG is safe when used as a food ingredient or used as a seasoning in food. This is the timeline of how many times and when these different regulatory agencies reviewed the scientific evidence. And you can see, or I hope this is convincing as people that are science-minded, that it is safe for the general population. And in fact, I just want to point out as well that the International Headache Society also removed it from its list of triggers in 2018 because the scientific evidence is not there to support that. The reason I have passion around this ingredient is because of this benefit right here, and that is MSG, even though it's got sodium in the name, it's only 12% sodium by weight. And in fact, because it triggers the umami receptor in the mouth, it can be used to reduce table salt, sodium chloride in food pretty significantly. And because of the negative reputation of MSG, we are not using it as one of the tools for reducing sodium. When I started my career 25 years ago, I worked on reduced sodium. And here we are today in 2024, and it is still a significant issue within not only North America, but a lot of countries globally. Now, MSG is not going to fix the entire issue, but it's a tool in a toolbox that can be used to drive down sodium levels. And as a reminder, 9 out of 10 Americans overconsume sodium. So we have a lot of work to do to be able to help people get down to levels that are considered healthy. So this is just a quote from the dietary reference intakes acknowledging this benefit. And then it was also noted that MSG is a sodium reduction tool in a prior National Academy publication from 2010, the strategies to reduce sodium intake in the United States. There's been numerous studies to demonstrate this in a variety of different foods. So this is one that I was excited to be part of because the studies that had been conducted, and rightly so, were in very high sodium foods in the food supply, such as sausage, such as certain soups. And yes, MSG works in those food products to drive down salt without tasting too different. But what hadn't been done was to see if this same principle worked in foods that we want people to be consuming more of, and it does. So this was a study at UC Davis where we were able to achieve a 30 to 60% reduction in sodium levels without it impacting the liking of those products. This was in roasted vegetables, a quinoa. We had a vegetable fried rice, and then we also did a non-dairy-based dip. So it's a pretty versatile tool when it comes to sodium reduction. If you look across all of the different applications that it's been tested in, it's about a 30 to 50% reduction in those foods, those processed foods that we know are contributing to the higher intakes of sodium. So this is something that has been proven. I listed some of the different applications here: soups, broths, chips, sausage. Again, I just mentioned the better for you foods. You know, this is a tool that can be used successfully within the food industry, but is not being utilized because of this misinformation that has persisted all these decades. So we know that things are shifting, especially with the younger audience. They're much more receptive to MSG, so there is hope that it can be utilized potentially more in the future. A lot of the headlines that we've seen are very favorable. We know that chefs are beginning to talk more about how they're using it in their cooking in a positive way. We've seen more interest in the plant-based eating and utilizing this to bring back the umami that sometimes is missing. So we are hopeful that this will continue to proceed in the direction of people knowing the facts. At the end of the day, we want to promote the facts. But as of April, when we conducted this report, we still know that 42% of people in the US have heard that MSG isn't safe, but 60% of those people don't know where they heard it from. So again, that legacy of that article and this Chinese restaurant syndrome has continued forward decades later. And these are the facts here that are most concerning. So we have about a quarter of people in the US that are avoiding restaurants that use MSG because of this fear, and then about 20% of people in the US that are avoiding Chinese food because they worry about MSG. It is used in other cuisines. So it is not an ingredient that is specific to Chinese food, but because of that title, Chinese restaurant syndrome, it is associated with that particular cuisine. And this is why, in this example anyway, why it matters. It's because it's been perpetuating this stigma against not only Chinese food, but it is affecting Asian food and Asian people. So from our survey, 29% of Asian people in the US have experienced this stigma because of that term, Chinese restaurant syndrome. And so it's limiting our ability to make some of these changes, or at least the perception changes, as well as consider it as a sodium reduction tool because of this misinformation. And Jess, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Tia. So in addition to MSG, we thought another interesting case study would be looking at the raw milk situation. There's been an ongoing debate, but I think it's a really great way to illustrate how misinformation can directly impact public health. So I'm sure you all know, and we'll talk about it in the next few slides, but there's growing concern over the transmission of diseases like H5N1 bird flu through raw milk, as well as many other bacteria and pathogens, even though that risk is essentially eliminated when we pasteurize milk. Yet, there's a growing segment of the population that has really doubled down on raw milk. They insist it's safe and actually beneficial for our health. So let's talk a little bit about this. So a little bit of background. Recent detection of H5N1 in dairy, cattle, and milk supplies has really reignited debates about raw milk consumption. Just as a personal aside, I live in Western Massachusetts in a pretty rural area with lots of dairy farms, and I can tell you that people feel very, very strongly about this topic. So some of the misinformation trends I'm seeing, I just wanted to boil down some for you. So that some people claiming that pasteurization actually increases the risk of infection, which of course is not biologically plausible given the mechanism of pasteurization. False claims about raw milk's ability to boost immunity against H5N1 and also just generally to boost immune function. And theories linking pasteurization to decreased nutritional values. Now, what's the impact of this? We're seeing an increased interest in raw milk despite heightened risks. And actually, there was a report recently, sorry I didn't include it here, but that raw milk sales are actually through the roof right now. There's a lot of confusion among consumers about milk safety, and health professionals are really facing challenges in countering the tsunami of misinformation around raw milk right now. And so definitely social media is amplifying sensationalized claims. This also, there's the issue of pre-existing beliefs about the benefits of natural foods and a mistrust in food safety regulations and health authorities. Okay. So to further illustrate the impact of misinformation surrounding raw milk, as you're likely already aware, people do get very sick from raw milk, even outside of this particular outbreak of H5N1. So if you look back from 1998 to 2018, there were over 2,600 cases of illness and 228 hospitalizations linked specifically to raw milk consumption. And what I found really alarming is that actually nearly half of the cases occurred in children, in people under the age of 19. So we really need to emphasize the public health risks of raw milk consumption and dispel misconceptions around its supposed benefits, as the nutritional profiles of raw and pasteurized milk are nearly identical. And I'll talk more about this in just a sec. But I find it interesting that in the midst of an outbreak spreading across the U.S., and we have dozens of herds confirmed to be infected with H5N1, this is somehow, we're still seeing an increase more than ever in raw milk sales. But again, the good news is that the risk to humans via milk consumption is essentially eliminated if we consume pasteurized milk. A little bit more about this, and just in the interest of time, I'm glossing over some of the details, but a little bit more about the dangers of raw milk, since this is such a hot topic. So the CDC estimates that people who consume raw milk are 840 times more likely to contract a foodborne illness than those who drink pasteurized milk. Raw milk can harbor pathogens like E. coli and Campylobacter, which can cause serious, sometimes fatal health outcomes. And as discussed, there's this persistent belief that it's more nutritious than pasteurized milk, but we've seen numerous studies have shown that pasteurization has minimal impact on the nutritional value of milk. Claims about raw milk superior nutrition they just do not hold up to scrutiny. And while there may be some minimal reductions in the concentration of vitamins when we pasteurize milk, there's no clinical impact or difference in the nutritional value of raw versus pasteurized milk. So nutrition misinformation has far-reaching consequences that extend beyond individual dietary choices. So I'm going to highlight just a few here. But one, it fuels dangerous trends and behaviors, so the promotion of extreme or unbalanced diets, encouragement of unnecessary supplement use, propagation of unfounded detox or cleansing regimens, which can actually be harmful, and the discouragement from seeking medical advice for serious conditions. We also see the stigmatization of safe and affordable and accessible foods. Frozen foods, canned foods, things like that are often vilified, or the claims that they're less healthy than raw, whole foods. There's a creation of unnecessary fear around common food ingredients. Yes, we talked about MSG. There are so many others, food additives, preservatives, dyes in food that are so closely monitored for safety and regulated. We also see the promotion of expensive superfoods, which are actually not more nutritious than their alternatives, and really just this overall undermining of public health initiatives aimed at improving nutrition. Just briefly, there are also some broader implications like the erosion of trust in credible health information sources. We see a lot of confusion, which leads to decision paralysis, and a lot of food-related anxiety and fear, which is really terrible. There's also a misdirection of consumer spending towards unnecessary products or services. And something that I think is really interesting, something I didn't cite here, but I've read quite a bit, that it's the folks who are in lower socioeconomic statuses that often they will forego eating things like fruits and vegetables when they can't afford organic alternatives versus conventional alternatives because they've been convinced that they're either unsafe or unhealthy. And that's obviously problematic for many reasons that I know that you know. So what can nutrition professionals do? Just briefly, overall enhancing digital literacy. So focus on developing skills to navigate and evaluate online information and sharing those with your clients and patients. You really want to stay updated on current trends and popular sources of misinformation. This can give you a headache. I know every time I log into TikTok, I get a little bit of a headache when I see the misinformation that's being spread there in particular, like wildfire. But it is very important to understand the information that is going viral. And one thing that I wanted to call out here is that different platforms are used by different demographics. So that's something to be mindful of depending on the populations that you hope to reach. Really focus on crafting clear, relatable messages. Always be transparent about your sources. Provide links to sources whenever possible. Use storytelling and anecdotes to help bring scientific information to life. And help your patients and your clients really think critically about how to evaluate nutrition claims. Help provide tools to them for distinguishing between credible and unreliable sources. So, for example, the difference between an influencer who has no training in nutrition versus the scientific consensus or statements put out by medical and scientific organizations. I could go on, but I know in the interest of time, I'll stop here and we can dig in more in the Q&A. So, in short, and while we're all here today, is that we need to bring facts back to the table. We need to emphasize facts over fear and help people make decisions that are guided by credible data. So, effectively combating nutrition misinformation requires more than just presenting facts. If people wanted just facts or information, they would pick up a textbook. Instead, it really demands an approach that's rooted in empathy, active listening, and transparency. So just a couple of tips for you all. Listen first, actively engage with people's food-related concerns and questions, identify knowledge gaps and underlying worries, and don't judge. You want to create a really safe space for people to voice their concerns. And then use this understanding to then tailor information effectively to folks who you're trying to reach. I love the phrase, meet people where they are, because this is what we have to do. We have to recognize that people are coming to the table with varying levels of nutrition knowledge, also cultural habits and cultural norms. So we need to be mindful and adapt our communication style to suit individual understanding. And then again, you always use relatable examples and clear jargon-free language. You want to demonstrate patience and empathy, prioritize transparency, always encourage critical thinking, build trust through honesty, so being open about areas of scientific uncertainty and not falling into the trap of absolutism. I think it's important to lean into the nuance, and just really adopting empathetic, listener-focused approaches will help nutrition professionals more effectively address misinformation. Now, I think a lot of what I was going to say here will be redundant with other slides, so I'll just highlight a few things. That science literacy is really at the heart of all of this, so we need to collectively support educational initiatives that improve basic scientific understanding and help develop programs that teach critical thinking and the scientific method. And I think this starts in early education. We're not just talking about adults, but we can start laying the groundwork for our kids. It's also incredibly important to have your finger on the pulse of public perspectives. Assess current attitudes, awareness, and interest in different scientific topics. Evaluate public exposure to scientific information and factors that influence individual views on nutrition. Analyze influences on public perception. Definitely, as we've talked about quite a bit today, you want to acknowledge the role of social media in this landscape, and just again be mindful of the different platforms on social media and different ways that you can effectively reach different groups. But I just wanted to highlight one strategy that I thought could be impactful, and that's to provide actionable, relatable information. And a prime example is addressing chemophobia and the fear of scientific terms. Now, I don't know if you've all seen this, but there are many influencers out there who have millions of followers, and they run around their grocery store and they're scaring people and saying that they shouldn't buy things with ingredients they can't pronounce. This always baffles me, and I love to use an example that's really tangible and relatable for people. So here in this slide, you could see, a blueberry, and this just helps showcase why that is nonsensical. So you can demystify chemical names and explain that every substance is a chemical, and that chemical names are just systematic descriptions of composition and structure, and that the name of a chemical does not determine its safety or harm. You want to use familiar foods. Again, here I'm using the example of a blueberry, which contains 3-methylbutyraldehyde, which sounds super technical, but it's just a natural compound that contributes to the blueberry flavor. Help contextualize information for folks, explain the purpose of chemicals in food for various things like flavor or preservation or nutrition, and discuss how the body processes various chemical compounds and also the ways that we excrete them. Certainly you want to address safety concerns. Something that I like to do quite a bit is focus on food safety and regulation and all the ways that we assess that the ingredients in our foods are in fact safe. And finally, I find that positive framing is really helpful, and highlighting how understanding chemistry enhances appreciation for food and how chemical knowledge drives innovations in nutrition and food safety. Okay, wrapping up here. So as we conclude, it's really crucial to recognize the growing impact of nutrition misinformation, particularly on social media platforms. This is not just a matter of harmless misconceptions. It's a really serious public health concern that can have far-reaching consequences. It fuels stigmas. It makes people feel ashamed about their food choices or body image. It hampers our ability to implement effective public health policies, and it can spark dangerous trends that put people's health at risk. And often it unfairly demonizes foods that are safe, affordable, and accessible to many people. But there's hope. As health professionals, we're on the front lines, and really we have a responsibility and a real opportunity to promote accurate, reliable nutrition information. And enhancing science literacy, we can really help people distinguish fact from fiction in this very noisy world of nutrition advice. So with that, thank you, and I think we're moving to a Q&A, so I'll pause here.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jess and Tia. That was awesome. We have a lot of questions coming in, so I'm going to jump right in. Tia, I'm going to start with you to give Jess a break to catch her breath. First question for you, Tia. Isn't there a discrepancy between L-glutamate and R-glutamate, as the body makes one but has problems with the other, which is the synthetically made MSG?
Thanks for the question. So MSG currently is made from fermentation. So it starts with a source of sugar, and depending on where you are in the world, that source may differ. In the U.S., it's corn, so corn sugar is the starting material. And then there's actually a microbe that's found in nature that will consume the glucose, and again, through fermentation, will convert it into glutamate. So it's many amino acids actually come from that process. There are microbes all over the world that do amazing things, one of which is convert sugars into various amino acids. So it comes out in the L format, and it's the same that's in the body. And it's the same that would be in a native protein before it gets broken down. And then maybe I'll give Jess just a little more of a break here and comment on the fact that, once it's consumed, well, first of all, as soon as MSG hits any sort of liquid, the bond between the sodium and the glutamate breaks. And so then you have free sodium that contributes to whatever other sodium molecules might be within that bite of food or the sip of soup that you've taken. And then you have glutamate that also gets mixed in with any other sources of glutamate that happen to be in that particular food. And once it's consumed, very little of it passes into our bloodstream. And that's because it gets consumed almost fully by the cells that line the GI tract, either as energy or it gets converted into another compound, such as pyruvate, or oftentimes you may see it come out as alanine, another amino acid. So about 95% of the glutamate that's consumed, and again, it doesn't matter where it comes from, gets utilized within that intestinal cell, either for energy or conversion to another compound. So this thinking that the glutamate that you eat is somehow going to end up in your bloodstream and then pass into the blood-brain barrier, which is a highly regulated tissue, and amino acids cannot cross in there without the appropriate receptor there. It doesn't make any biochemical sense. So I'll pause there and turn it back to you, Leslie.
Great. Perfect. Okay, Jess, if you've caught your breath, I've got a question for you, which I think is going to be useful for everyone. Do you think there's a social media platform that's most worthwhile for us as practitioners to be on to address this kind of information to the largest amount of the general public?
I love this question. I touched on this briefly in the presentation, but I'll elaborate a bit. The answer is it depends. It depends on who it is you're trying to reach. The different social media platforms really have very different demographic followings. So Facebook, for example, tends to reach an older population, a more politically conservative population. Their text-based content tends to be more effective versus Instagram, which I mentioned. A lot of my content is presented as infographics, so very graphics heavy. That tends to do better on Instagram with a younger group of people. If your goal is to reach the youngest folks, then definitely TikTok. That's what the youngest, the youngest in our population are using. That's where so much misinformation does go viral. It also comes down to what you are comfortable producing in terms of content. Do you want to produce video content, which is what you need for TikTok? Are you more comfortable with long-form communication, which does better on Facebook or via Substack, which is a newsletter platform? Or do you like the simplicity of graphics and infographics? And if so, then you might do better on an Instagram. And I will say there's also a lot of power in some of the newer platforms like Threads and also X, which is formerly Twitter. There's power to these because you're limited in terms of character count. So if you want to make very short but punchy statements, I mean, those platforms are great for that, whereas some of the other platforms, they have different character count limits, so you can go into a bit more detail. So long story short, it just depends on what your goals are, how you want to present information, how you're most comfortable presenting information, and who you want to reach. And the last thing I'll say is that definitely authenticity goes a very long way on social media. So I find when I force myself to do a TikTok video, that's not my comfort zone. I'm not super comfortable doing video type content, and my impact is definitely less. I have less of an impact on TikTok than I do on these other platforms. You just have to figure out what works best for you.
Great. Perfect. Thank you for diving in a little bit deeper on that one. Okay, Tia, we're going to come back to you. You had mentioned that MSG has 12% sodium by weight. How much sodium in milligrams for a teaspoon?
Thank you. So a teaspoon of MSG is 480 milligrams of sodium. If somebody is interested in trying MSG as a sodium reduction tool, you can take a salt shaker and you can split it 50-50, table salt with MSG, mix it up, and then use it as you would salt. And then every time you use it, it's a 40% less amount of sodium in every use. So there's just an easy way that somebody can try it at home and derive a benefit on the sodium intake levels.
Great. Let's see. All right, this one's a little bit more of a softer question, but also very important. How do we handle when friends or loved ones are receiving food misinformation from other healthcare professionals like doctors?
This really drives me bananas. It is difficult, and this is why I think it's important to not lean too heavily. I mean, we want to emphasize that expertise is important, but that isn't the sole criteria, right? There are other things that people have to consider, and so I like to warn folks that while you may have a trusted source of information, maybe there's a particular provider who you like very much, and you trust what they're saying, you always have to defer to the consensus. Because we as individuals, we have our own biases, all have expertise in all things. My expertise is in data science and evaluation. I actually don't have deep subject matter expertise in nutrition. So we have to be mindful of, that just because a person has a PhD or an MD or whatever it might be, that doesn't make them an expert in all things. So in this case, again, I like to emphasize for folks that we can't just get our information from a single source, and we always have to refer back to the consensus and trust, these large professional organizations, for example, any, medical or nutrition organization, those, they come together and provide expert consensus on topics, and that's where you want to defer.
Great. All right. Jess, I'm going to stick with you for our next one because you were touching on scientific research. From Michelle, she is wondering your thoughts on the idea that scientific research might be biased based on who's funding it and the motivation behind that funding. So therefore, we might not have research on certain things due to the fact that there's no one there to financially gain from funding those possible studies and thus the possible results. Any comments or thoughts on that concept?
Such a great question, and so important because, as we discussed, trust is such a big issue. And certainly, if there are financial motives, that's something to be to be mindful of. But I think it's important for folks to be mindful of the fact that, yeah, sure, the dairy industry, they're likely going to fund their own studies. I mean, that's how things happen in industry, right? You have to do your own research on your products to deem them, safe before being released to the public. But we also have so many other measures in place and regulations in place. So it's not just the industry that's doing the research. We also have real-world monitoring of safety. So if there were to be, if milk was unsafe, that would be detected by our public health surveillance systems. So yes, there are industry-funded studies, but there's also so much beyond that, and especially when a lot of the industry-funded studies, they're still going through a peer review process, which means that others outside of industry are very, very closely, looking at the methodologies that were employed to really pick up on any of those biases. So no, it's not perfect, but it's not like it's only industry doing the research.
Great. And Tia, I want to give you a chance to comment on that too as we wrap this up.
Yeah, so I've been on the other side of that, where I have been at companies or at organizations where I've been providing funding to academics to do research on either a product or a service in some cases. And I will acknowledge that maybe 20 or 30 years ago that we weren't doing a great job in terms of transparency and helping people have confidence in that research. But I've found that over the last at least 10 or 15 years that companies have gone almost over the top to try to minimize bias as much as possible. They're aligning with all of the guidelines that have been put out there with how do you reduce bias in research, and they are trying to stay out of the scientific process as much as possible so that the academics can design, execute, and write up the results without any input from the funding source. So I think things have changed considerably, and I hope that people will evaluate the science based on the quality of the science and not get too hung up with the funding source, because that is one of many aspects to consider when evaluating research.
Awesome. Thank you both so much. This was a really anticipated webinar, and I'm so glad you were here to share your expertise with us. So thanks again for being here.
Thank you so much. This was so fun. Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you. Appreciate the opportunity.
And with that, we've come to the end of the webinar. Your attendance certificates are now available to download. You can follow the instructions on the screen or refer to the final slide of the presentation handout for information on how to complete the webinar evaluation and then access and download your certificate. The credit claiming email will be sent out within the next 24 hours, likely within the next 2 to 3 hours today. The presentation handouts were emailed to you earlier today, but if you didn't receive them or were not able to download them in time, links to download them will also be included in that credit claiming email again for you to grab the handouts. So thanks again, everyone, for joining us. Thanks, Dr. Steyer, Dr. Rains, and everyone on the line for coming in for this webinar. It was a great show. I wish everyone a great rest of your day and a fantastic rest of your week.